Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started. As as I've been promising you for 2 weeks, there really is going to be a handout. Um, Next week, it'll be in the form of a book next week. I figure we'll go ahead and get it. I'll get it to Jeremy. He can get it up in the email, and then we'll get copies to everyone from the things that we've been going through the last few weeks. So we'll be doing that. We're winding down here. Hard to believe, but in the next 2 weeks, tonight and next week, is our last class on the Olivet Discourse for this time. But there's more to come. So I've been sharing with you at the beginning for the last several weeks something that I receive like a devotional every Friday from Dr. Fred Shea. And it's for some reason he's just been spot on the last few weeks, and I wanted to share this week's. I just take a little clip from his devotional, and he's in Hebrews 11. He was talking about faith, and I like this. He says, "Faith is vision. However, we must remember faith is not being sure." Is not being sure things will turn out okay. Faith is being okay no matter how things turn out. I thought that was pretty good. You have to think about that. That's the way he kind of puts things like that. But you have to think about that. It's not so much that we want things to turn out the way we want them to turn out. It's that they turn out the way that God wants them to turn out. And I think that's true when it comes to the matter of faith. It's true in as we live our lives for the Lord on day by day. You can probably go ahead and open to Matthew 24. It's going to take us a few minutes to get there because I've got something. I check news articles, and if something is relevant to this class, I like to bring it up. And found this past week about the Temple Mount. Now that's where this whole Matthew 24-25 starts at. Actually, it starts at the end of chapter 23 as they're getting ready to leave the Temple Mount. And I thought this was kind of an interesting article. I want to quote some of it from the printout. But it has to do with Jews that are visiting the Temple Mount in record numbers now. Which I thought was kind of interesting. I thought that there'd be a lot more than the numbers indicate, but they're starting to become more and more evident up on the Temple Mount, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But let me just read you a few sentences from this article about these record visits. It says Jewish visits to the Temple Mount hit a record in 2022. With 51,483 going to the holy site last year, according to Biadu, I think is how you say that. I don't know. It's whatever it is. It's a Jewish word, and I'm butchered it, I'm sure. It's a Jewish-based organization that's seeking to advance Jewish ties to the Temple Mount. Okay. Now, if you know anything about the Temple Mount, that all makes sense. If you don't, just bear with me. We're going to look at the Temple Mount in a moment. The spokesman for this organization says, we're working on getting the Temple Mount included in Israeli educational system and in the Ministry of Education's curriculum for all schools. In other words, they're trying to get the schools, our students here go on field trips and all that. Well, they're trying to get the students in Israel to be able to visit the Temple Mount and see what exactly it is. He goes on and says, talking about the police that patrol, these are Israeli police now that patrol up there. They say the police do an amazing job of keeping the order and peace up there. It's not an easy job. But he says that when they try to stop a Jew from praying, bowing, or waving an Israeli flag, or doing something they consider provocative, now these are Israeli police, okay? then we film it and we hold them accountable for their illegal actions, he calls them. So it's kind of interesting. He says, while the Temple Mount is the holiest place in the world for Jews, rabbis are increasingly divided over Jewish visits. In other words, there's a division within the religious sect in Israel over Jews going up to the Temple Mount. It says, for centuries, the rabbinic consensus was that the laws of ritual purity still applied to the site. But in recent years, a growing number of rabbis have argued that the ritual purity laws don't apply to all sections of the Temple Mount and encourage visits to permitted areas to maintain Jewish connections to the site. And one of the biggies is the new national security minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who actually went up on the temple. Now, this is a big deal. I mean, it doesn't sound like, oh, what's the big deal? This is really a big deal for the security minister to go up onto the Temple Mount and to walk around up there. You know, he didn't do anything else, didn't do any praying or anything. He didn't want to get arrested, of course. Okay? And just as a reminder, okay, the Temple Mount is where the first and second temples were built. Of course, it's the holiest site in Judaism. And this goes back, the current situation at the Temple Mount now goes back to the 1967 war, when Israel liberated the old city of Jerusalem from Jordan during the 6-Day War. Now, I think we're all old enough to remember that, the 6-Day War. What's interesting is that, fearing a religious war, then Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, you all remember him with the patch? You know, he had the black patch. He was the defense minister at this time. He agreed to the Islamic trusteeship, I think that's how you say that, to continue managing the holy site for day-to-day affairs, while Israel would maintain overall sovereignty and be responsible for security. So right now, the Muslims control the Temple Mount. Okay, this is I don't know if the agreement that was made back in 1967. They would control the Temple Mount. Israel will provide security on the Temple Mount. And when we were there, flash forward here to some cool pictures. When we were there back in September, you see armed Israeli guards walking all around the Temple Mount. And it's interesting because, you know, there's hundreds of people everywhere, you know, up there taking pictures and all this stuff. Lots, I mean, Muslims as well as non-Muslims up there. And it's interesting because one of the ways that the Muslims control the Temple Mount is that women have to be very careful about what they wear up there. In other words, Jane has a sweater on. Women have to have their arms covered and their legs covered. Okay, if you're caught up there, they'll throw you off the mountain. I mean, they won't throw you, but they'll escort you. They probably could, but
they provided garments for you to wear.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's true. Yeah, the Muslims will actually, as you enter the mount, as you go up to the top and enter it, there's a place there where they'll give you shawl or whatever you need. And then when you exit, you just turn it in. But it's kind of interesting. The other thing is that if you're caught holding hands up there, it's a no-no. No touching. Okay, and they'll come up to you and tell you, you know, no holding hands, no touching, whatever. So it's kind of interesting. Again, this is the Muslims. They're the ones that are controlling the day-to-day operation of the Temple Mount. And you know, you're all familiar with the Dome of the Rock and all that's up there, because Muslims go up there and they, you know, we couldn't go into the Dome of the Rock, but Muslims go up there and for prayer and everything else that's up there. So I just thought this is kind of interesting. This is what it looks like. And just so you understand, I think we've probably gone over this before, but it's worth repeating. You need to, because the terms come out in the news, and it's like, whatever, I don't know where they're talking about, but this is what they're talking about. The Dome of the Rock is, over in the center of the picture there. That's that portion there, that Dome of the Rock, and just beside it, where you see the trees and stuff. That is where they think the third temple should go. Now, this is a real problem, okay? There will be a third temple. There has to be a third temple, or Daniel 9:27 is in air, okay? Because during the tribulation, the Antichrist will stop remember the abomination of desolation, all that's going to take place up here on the Temple Mount in the third temple. So it's kind of amazing, that you're walking around and you're thinking about these things that are going to happen sometime in the future. It's interesting because the Temple Mount was not really that big a deal to the Muslims until Israel took control back in 1967. Okay? As a matter of fact, their holy book, the Quran does not mention Jerusalem at all. There's no word, there's nothing in the Quran about Jerusalem. There's something in there about the holy city, and they mention it only because they think at this right here, this Dome of the Rock, they believe that that's where Muhammad ascended back to Allah from that portion. There is a rock there, whether it's the rock where, according to their teaching, Abraham sacrificed Ishmael. Okay, figure that one out. Or where Abraham may have sacrificed Isaac. Take your pick. But there's nothing there. That the only reason this is holy to them is because this is where Muhammad supposedly ascended back to Allah on a horse, on a steed, by the name of Barak. Now you can't make this stuff up. It's in there. It's in their book, and I just report the news. But it's kind of interesting, like I said, and I bring it to your attention along with this article just because there's a lot that's going to be going on up here, and who knows what's going to happen through this year. There is a big movement and I know I'm sidetracked already, but there's a big movement within Israel to start a third temple up there. Where and how and when, I don't know, but they're ready to start. We visited a place called the Temple Institute while we were in Jerusalem. They have everything ready to go into the new temple. They have the clothing. They have it. You can't take pictures in there. I snuck a picture, but I was told no pictures. But they have everything. They have everything. We saw the table where the showbread will go. All of this stuff is made. I mean, they've got it done. And I already told you about the red heifer. There's just one thing after another that's happening over there, that they're getting ready to build a third temple. And, when it's going to happen, who knows? And how it's going to happen, I don't have a clue. But it has to go here. It can't go anywhere else in Israel. It has to be here. So how that'll happen, who knows? Stay tuned. We'll get the news to you as soon as we can. Okay. Let's go to Matthew 24, which just happens to be taking place. Here's the Kidron Valley, by the way, over here. So Christ exited the temple. Somewhere over here is the Eastern Gate, or the Golden Gate, or the Beautiful Gate. It's got several names. He went down into the Kidron Valley and went up this side over here. That's where that's the Mount of Olives. You ascend the Mount of Olives, and that's where he's giving chapter 24 and 25 of Matthew's Gospel. just 3 days before he's going to be arrested and crucified. So this is very close. I mean, this is Passion Week that we're talking about. And I don't know if I brought that out at all during our study, but this is the last. This happens on a Tuesday. This happens on a Tuesday. The Olivet Discourse happens on a Tuesday. Thursday will be the Upper Room Discourse. And then, of course, he's going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane and be arrested and so on. So anyways, we ended up last week talking about verse 31 that concludes the section that answers the two questions that the disciples have asked at the beginning of chapter 24. Those two questions were, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Well, from verse 4 on through verse 31, Christ answers those questions. He's now he's answered those questions, and now he's going to use parables from verse 32. Now watch this, from verse 32 all the way to the end of chapter 25. Okay, there'll be eight parables that he's going to give. We're going to start tonight looking at the first one, the parable of the fig tree. And I'm not sure how much further we're going to get in that. We may touch a little bit on some verses after that, but he's using these parables to teach some things. And I want you to keep a few things in mind. I put this list together, and it's going to be, you're going to hear some of this stuff repeated as we go through our lesson tonight and probably into next week also. But we need to keep in mind that all the parables refer to the events that he's covered. Just mentioned that. Verse 24, 3 or 4, all the ways to verse 31. Okay, that's what the parables will do. He's covering that in these parables. He's not introducing, this is key, he is not introducing new material with these parables. Okay, the parables number 3 on this list. The parables are serving as illustrations. They're illustrating what he has just finished teaching. That's what the parables are for. Now, a lot of people want to take these parables and, run off with them. We saw that a few weeks ago when I quoted from a couple scholars who say the parables in Matthew 25 actually have to do with social reform and social issues, and that's what they're there for. You have to really stretch it to find that there. But anyways, the parables are important lessons that relate to Israel. And again, I think the whole Olivet Discourse is to Israel. And I've been teaching that since day one. Okay. Finally, all the parables relate to the second coming or second advent of Christ. They do not relate to the rapture of the church. Okay. Now, I've made that clear starting when I started teaching last year, April or something like that, when we started teaching on the Olivet Discourse. Okay. From that point forward, I've been telling you that we're going to be in this Olivet Discourse for a while, and it's all geared to Israel. It's all geared to Israel and the second coming of their Messiah, okay, which they're getting ready, and we're in 24, 25. They're getting ready to reject him completely and nail him to a cross. Okay? Any questions up to this point? Silence. Yes, ma'am.
I read that they've already drawn up the blueprints for the new temple, and that they're already training the people who are going to be working there.
Yeah, I
read that too. Okay.
Yeah, it chokes me up when I think about it. Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yeah, I've read that they are training priests and Levites. They have to be Levites, of course, to how to sacrifice and all that. There's some splinter groups that are trying to get up there. Watch what happens. Okay, I won't be teaching. Wayne will be teaching. But watch what happens around Easter time when Passover comes. Because last year there were some real issues. There was some zealots that tried to get up onto the Temple Mount and sacrifice a lamb up there. Okay, now talk about an international incident that could take place. I mean, it's that close. I mean, it could start with something like that. But yeah, there's a lot of things going on. But getting back to this, got to keep that in mind. Like I said, this isn't anything new. I've been telling you this for not just weeks but months. Okay, let's go to we're in Matthew 24. Let me have someone read verses 32 through 35. This is the parable of the fig tree, and the verses that follow it. They kind of all tie together before he goes on to the next one. But let me get someone out there to read Matthew 24, verses 32 through 35, please.
From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
Okay, good. That's the section that we're going to be in. I have it up on the screen in the NIV, and it's follows pretty close. The one thing I want to point out is that in the NIV, I think it might be a New King James. Will look down about the middle where I have that word it. Okay, it is near. Translations like I'm using, I've got the New American Standard up here, and it says that he is near. So it's either, depending on your translation, you're either going to have he is near or it is near. Now, what the difference is. Some think that the it might refer back to that neat Greek word that we brought up a few weeks ago, the parousia, which is the coming, his advent. So that makes sense. And also the idea that he is near, referring to Christ himself, or the Messiah or the Savior is near. I don't lose sleep over that one. There's some other things in the NIV I lose sleep over, but this isn't one of them, because there are other translations that use, and I think, like I said, I think the New King James uses the word it, because that's what I usually study at home on, is the New King James. I think it has the word it. Does it? Okay. Either it's not a big deal. Either way works. So that's what's key. That's what's key. So what about this fig tree? What about this fig tree? Okay, the fig tree can represent Israel, and you can see I've got a grocery list of verses up there that if you want to write down in the next 10 seconds, be quick. That actually refer to Israel as the fig tree, or fig blossom or something like that. So there's there's nothing wrong with referring to Israel as the fig tree, but I don't think it works in this case here in Matthew 24. Well, why do you think that, Paul? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let me tell you why. Okay. This is where cross-referencing in your Bible study is very important. And you can see up on the screen, I've got Luke 21, verses 29 and 30, which are the same ones that we read here in verse 24, 32, and 33. Look what it says, and I'm just quoting part of it here. Then he told them a parable. Behold, the fig tree and all the trees, as soon as they bring forth leaves, you see it and you know for yourself that summer is now near. Okay. Now that's the cross reference over in Luke. It's the same dialogue that's going on over here in Luke 21, 29, and 30 and following. But notice that Luke adds the words all the trees, and he talks about they, meaning all of the trees, when they put forth their leaves, you know that summer's getting close. So that's one thing that kind of, when I check the cross reference, I'm thinking, that's kind of that kind of throws some, question on the idea of Israel being the fig tree over here in Matthew 24. So possible interpretation that some people propose is that the fig tree represents Israel and that all the trees represent the Gentile nations. I don't know if I'm going to read that deep into this. We have to understand it's a parable, and it's a parable. It's an illustration. One of the problems that most people have when they start to try and interpret parables is they want to give meaning to every single word in the parable. That's not how the parables work. They don't work that way. If you try and do that, you're off in la la land, honestly. I mean, you have to make sure that you understand what parables are for. They're used as an illustration. They're used as, and as long as you keep that in mind, you don't start pressing every single word to try and build your theology into a parable. It's very dangerous to do. Very dangerous to do. Okay. Everyone's heard of Hal Lindsey, right? Oh yeah. This is the first book I ever read as a new Christian, and I'm going to talk about that next week, by the way. But this was the first book I read, was The Late Great Planet Earth. Back in 1970 was when it was published. I read it a little bit later than that, but look what Lindsay writes in The Late Great Planet Earth. Okay, these are his words. But the most important sign in Matthew has to be the restoration of the Jews to the land in the rebirth of Israel. Even the figure of speech, fig tree, has been a historic symbol of national Israel. Now, that's true. It has been. I don't think in this case it is. When the Jewish people, after nearly 2,000 years of exile, under relentless persecution, became a nation again on May 14th, 1948, the fig tree put forth its first leaves. Okay, so what Lindsay is doing is he's equating Christ's words here in Matthew 24:32. He's taking that parable and he's now saying that the fig tree is a fulfillment of prophecy. Okay, and Lindsay takes some liberties in Late Great Planet. I'm usually lockstep with Lindsay on most of what he teaches as far as prophecy goes. I'm not so sure about this. I'm really not, because I think it's confusing. Because there's some things that I think come out when you dig into this. Okay, there's a lot of people that believe this now. Okay, and I've held this view for a lot of years that the fig tree, the blossoming of the fig tree, represents the rebirth of Israel. Okay, but it's hard to reconcile Luke's parallel reference with Matthew 24 when you start talking about the fig tree representing Israel. We know that the fig tree represents Israel throughout Scripture. We know that. I just don't think that Christ is going that deep on this. He's trying to illustrate something for his disciples. Another problem, the third bullet here, another problem with this view is verse 34. Verse 34. What are you going to do with this generation if it means Israel's rebirth as a nation in 1948? A lot of people have spent a lot of time and a lot of ink trying to get around this whole idea of the generation. When is the next generation or this generation? And I've heard a lot of very interesting interpretations on that, starting with, if you go 40 years from 1948, that's 19 what? Very good, you math students out there. It's 1988. Well, what happened in 1988? Nothing.
It was 40 years.
Nothing. It It was 40 years after 1948, but nothing happened. And then I've seen it adjusted where, well, no, it's not really 40 years, it's 60 years. So that takes us to what, 2008? Is that right? Am I right? Okay, my old math is still with me. Okay. What happened in 2008? Well, Jane and Paul moved to Georgia. Where's that at in here? Nothing happened over in the Middle East. Then. Well, it's 80 years. It's got to be 80 years. Okay. Now, so you see what they do? They just keep pushing it out far enough, and eventually you're going to die, and you can leave all your books to people to pick up, over at McAllister's for like 10 cents, 88 reasons to believe the rapture is going to happen in 1988. Okay. You can get that probably for 10 cents over at McAllister's now. Okay. Well, that didn't work. So the next year he came out with another book, 89 reasons why honestly, I mean, I'm not making this up. 89 reasons why the rapture is going to happen in 1989. That didn't happen. Well, now it's going to happen in 1994. Okay. And this fella, I don't want to give him any more credit than what he's due, but he's written like several books like that, to the point where I think he finally gave up and said he pushed it out so far he knew he'd be long gone before it could possibly be, incorrect. So
that's stupid. That throws out any chance to write more books.
That's true. That's true.
Write another book every 10 years.
Well, some people do. Some people do. So,
do you think that the term "this generation" is referring to starting with where he was right there and then as he was speaking, or is he talking about the generation that begins when the leaves begin to appear?
Yes.
Okay.
Just gotta wait. It's coming up.
Oh, okay.
It's coming up. We're gonna get there. I think tonight. We're gonna get there tonight. I have a good summary from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. I've been quoting him a lot in this because his book, The Footsteps of the Messiah, is a good reference book. Like I said, it's about 800 pages, but it's a good reference book. Don't plan on reading it some evening when you're trying to, stay awake, because, it's not one of those kind of books. It's not a page turner. It's a reference book. But he says this, talking about this whole incident about the fig tree. Okay, follow along with me. I'm going to read the quote. This is his quote. The point of the illustration is this: when the fig tree and all the other trees begin to blossom, it's a sure sign that summer is on the way, because the blossoming occurs in the spring. Then, in application of the illustration, Jesus said, so you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Just as blossoming of the fig tree means that summer is on the way, in the same way, when these events, what events are we talking about? The events that Jesus spoke about, verses 3 through 31. When these events begin to happen, when they, let me go back and start out. In the same way, when these events that Jesus spoke about occur, then that's the elect, can know that his return is near and that their salvation draws nigh. That's as simple an explanation of this parable as I think that anyone can give you. Okay, you don't need to read a whole lot into this. Christ is using it as an illustration. He's talking to men that have seen fig trees blossom. They've seen them, during the winter with nothing on them. But when they start to bud out in the spring, they know that summer's coming. That's what Christ is saying. In the same way, okay, when you see all these things, recognize that that's talking about himself, I believe, that he is near, right at the door. And that's what Christ is trying to say here. Okay? Let's not read too much into this. Like I said, what's the saying? uh, never make a parable stand on all four. Okay, because sure enough, you try and make his parable stand on all four, it's gonna collapse on you. Okay, it's there for a reason. You dig out the reason, and then you move on. Okay, you move on. Any questions, comments on? I want to make sure we're all on the same page here. Okay. Some final thoughts on this part before we move on. Again, remember that the parables in Matthew 24 and 25, beginning with this one we just read, the fig tree, are given as illustrations. Here's a nice, simple definition for a parable. It's a lesson of comparison, moving from known in order to explain the unknown. Okay, that's what Christ is trying to do here. Okay, he's with these parables. Problems arise when we turn illustrations into prophecy. And I think that's what Hal Lindsey did, in his book. Again, I like the book. I mean, I read it so much that I broke. You ever have a book? Of course, I bought the paperback. It was like this big, the paperback. Yeah, everyone's shaking their head. Yeah, I remember that one. And because that's all I could afford at the time, right? When I was working in Fort Lauderdale. Anyways, and I read that every day at lunch. And I just read it, and then I started highlighting it, read it again, and I was, with him all the ways until I started. It's amazing what happens when you start reading the Bible for yourself, and you start comparing, Now again, I'm not knocking Lindsay because I like him, and I like most everything that he writes. I just don't agree with him on this point. Okay, Christ's illustration is illustrating what he had previously told the disciples in verses 3 through 31. Okay, he is not introducing new material. Okay, clear as a bell, right? Have no problem with that one. Let's move on. What's all this about the generation thing? Okay, what is it? What's it got to do? I mean, what's Christ saying here? Verse 34. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Okay. Now, talk a little bit about some other views on this generation thing. I think most of you probably know who Hank Hanegraaff is, and who the late R.C. Sproul. Everyone, have you heard those names? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I've listened to both of these gentlemen for years, learned a lot from them, but I put Hank Hanegraaff aside when he finally came out. It took him years. He just kept putting people off. He finally came out, and he as a preterist. I'll explain that in a minute. Same thing with R.C. Sproul. When R.C. Sproul I got tired of listening to nothing but Calvinism from R.C. Sproul. Now, he's a 5-point Calvinist. If you're a Calvinist, don't hold that against me. I just got tired of hearing him talk every time, whatever he was talking about Calvinism. So I just gave up on him also. But follow along with these statements that I put together, okay? One popular interpretation held by all preterists. Now, what's a preterist? A preterist is someone who does not believe that the prophecies that we're reading are future. They believe that they've already been fulfilled. What? Yes, they believe that the prophecies have been fulfilled. Okay, Hank Hanegraaff and the late R.C. Sproul, and there's actually some futurists that hold this interpretation of Matthew 24, this section that we're in. Okay. They believe that all the events in the Olivet, now the preterists do, they believe that all the events in the Olivet Discourse, along with catch this now, the entire book of Revelation have already taken place. Okay? There's nothing to be fulfilled in the Olivet Discourse. There's nothing to be filled in the book of Revelation. It was all taken care of very nicely in 70 AD. Okay? That's where they put these 2 chapters. That's where they put the 22 chapters of Revelation. They park it into the destruction that took place in 70 AD. That's the preterist view. There's nothing future to happen. Okay, we're just going to get better and better, and eventually will be, well, they believe we're in the millennium anyways, but they think it's going to get so good that eventually Christ is going to want to come back because we're such nice people and he wants to come back and be with us. Or like I said, what's that?
That's not happening right now.
No, it's not. When I hear somebody say, well, if this is the kingdom, I must be living in the slums. Okay. But preterists teach. Look at this is what I want you to see. Preterists teach that the generation of Matthew 24:34 refers to the Jews who witnessed Rome's destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and they've written volumes on this. I mean, I've read sections of their teachings on this, and I've heard them speak on this, and it's like that's it. It all took place in 70 AD. It all took place. That's the generation that we're seeing here in Matthew 24:34 is the generation that Christ was speaking to that would witness the destruction by Rome in 70 AD. It's that simple. Ties it all up in a nice bow, put a happy face on it, and you're finished. Move on to chapter 26, okay? That's how we handle it as a preterist, okay? The problem, I think, is that there's really a lot of evidence, and I didn't want to get too technical, but, because we're already deeper, we're in deep weeds as it is, as the saying goes. But I think the overwhelming evidence from the context, always where we go to the context. Verses 4-31 show that these events are future. Okay, you can just go right down the things that Christ is talking about, starting in verse 4. And did any of that take place in 70 AD? There's no record anywhere of the sun being blotted, of it being night, of the moon going dark and the stars falling from heaven. None of that took place. None of that took place. There's no record. There's no historical record of it. Okay, so I think they're reading into it because it has to go along with their theology, and their theology says that there is no future prophecies that need to be fulfilled. Everything is fulfilled already. Does that make sense? Because there are a lot of people that teach this. A lot of good people teach this. Like I said, Hank Hanegraaff and R.C. Sproul. I like most of the stuff that they have to say, but you get them into prophecy, and this is all they know. This is their theology, or eschatology, I guess we should say. Okay? So keep that in mind. We could dwell here for a long time, but I've got a good, I think, summary statement from Dr. Randall Price, and we quoted from him back when we were remember when we were talking about Petra, and I had a quote from him up on the screen about the winter rains that come, and that's how it floods the wadis and all that stuff like that. That was Dr. Randall Price. Well, he's continuing in this same section that he was in, where he quoted that, talking about this idea of this generation. Look what he has to say. He says, for this generation of Matthew 24:34, Mark 13:30, and Luke 21:32, all these things, and he gives the verses in Matthew, Mark, and Luke again, all these things must refer contextually, there's our key word, must refer contextually to the events of the Great Tribulation and the conclusion of the times of the Gentiles, the coming of Christ in glory, and the regathering and redemption of Israel, all of which are not only declared to be future by Jesus at the time that he was speaking here look in Mark 13:23. But they are also cast in typical eschatological language. I like all those big words he uses because I can say them and not really. What he's saying is that Christ is using end time language here in the Olivet Discourse. Words, phrases like the end of the age, or things like this have not occurred since the beginning of the world, or the powers of the heavens are shaken. That's end time, or what he calls eschatological language. So he's talking about something that's down the road, that's going to come, not something that's going to take place in 40 years here in Matthew 24, but something that's down the road that will happen. Okay? Are you tracking with me? Does that make sense? Okay. I don't want to overstate it, but I think that's important for us to understand that this whole idea of the generation, that was a big stumbling block for me. It really was, because when 1985 rolled around and 1986 rolled around, and I kept hearing 40 years, it's a generation. I think most of that comes from the wandering in the wilderness. How long did they wander in the wilderness with Moses? Okay, and God told them then, this generation won't see the promised land. Only two will. Caleb and Joshua were the only two. But he states specifically to the generation that turned their back on him and didn't believe that he could do what he said he was going to do, you will not enter and that's a 40-year time span. So I think that's where we get this 40 years. And I think it's, like I said, Lindsay kind of tacks it on. Back in 1970, he could say that. He had 18 years to refine it. I don't know where he stands now, honestly. I haven't heard him speak in a while, but that's where it comes from. And that's where Price is coming from here. He's just saying, you got to think contextually. You got to look at the big picture. And from that, we dig out our eschatology. We don't push our eschatology into the text. We draw our eschatology from the text. Big difference. Okay. Questions, comments? Yes, ma'am.
I know. I don't know where in the Bible it specifically says, generation means this many number of years, but in the Old Testament, didn't they live for hundreds and hundreds of years?
Yes, they did. But remember the generation, the generation of Moses. I think Moses lived 100 and.
I think it's 125, I believe.
I knew it was 120 something or other, 125. But the age goes down. From the flood, it goes down, down. Yeah. And of course we get to, by the time they get into we read about kings living, till they were in their 80s or 70s or whatever. So, it's kind of on par with where we're at today. But I take, and again, I'm not saying this is where it's from, but it just makes sense that God told that generation specifically, you will not enter the promised land. For 40 years you're going to wander. So that generation died off, and the new generation took over and conquered the promised land under Joshua. So whether it's 40, whether it's 60, whether it's 80, I don't want to put. It's like, well, when's the Lord coming back? Well, let's see. I think it's going to be March 28th. It's like, people have been embarrassed through the years by putting numbers to where there aren't supposed to be numbers or dates. And so we are careful about that.
Has anybody considered the possibility that Jesus, looking at things from the point of view of eternity, could be talking use the word generation to just talk about the human race? Beginning to end.
Yeah, he could. He could be. Could be. I don't know if that's where he was coming from. I think if you dig into this word, this generation, I mean, it's used elsewhere. One of the arguments from the preterist is that everywhere in Matthew where this generation is used, it refers to the people that he's talking to. Okay, but we're in an eschatological portion here of Matthew's gospel. So those two words take on a different meaning here. Yeah, it's going to refer to a generation, but I think it's more specific. Which generation is the generation? He tells us very simply. I mean, this is the third time I've said it, I think. Okay, the generation that sees these things happen will be the ones that will see his return. What things is he talking about? We'll go back to verse 4 and read forward to verse 31 when those things happen. None of those things have happened yet in sequence. They just haven't happened. So, any other questions, comments? Oh, you're lucky because we're getting out early tonight. I thought there were going to be more questions and all, but next week we're going to wrap it up. Okay, and I'm gonna share some personal things from my testimony next week as we get started, and then I want to go through I want to go through the rest of this. We're still in this parable of the fig tree, verses 34 and 35. That's where we're at right now. We'll get to those. I'd like to get into if we can, and we'll play it by ear. I'll have material. It's just whether we'll get to it or not, because immediately he goes into the idea of the days of Noah. Okay, that's going to make for a very interesting study, is it not?